There is belief, and then there is skepticism. And between those two lies a vast territory of questions and the unknown. But what if reality is far more complex than we've been willing to perceive? And what if the stories that we dismissed as myth and legend hold the keys to understanding consciousness? From ghostly encounters to mysterious lights in the sky, humanity has always sensed there was something more out there. Some call it the paranormal, and others call it the divine. Some search the stars for answers, while others look within. They are all connected, threads in the grand tapestry of life. But we stand at a place where the fabric between realities is much thinner than you might think, because this is Crossroads of the Veil. To really get what happened on that awful night, August 21st, 1955, you can't just look at the facts. You have to feel the world the way it was back then. You have to breathe the same air the Sutton and Taylor families did. It was an air thick with a strange, buzzing energy, a mix of excitement for the future and a deep, gut-wrenching dread that something terrible was just around the corner. Imagine a whole country holding its breath, a quiet tension that settled over every farm and city like a heavy blanket on a hot summer night. Just 10 years before, the world had seen a new kind of sun rise over Japan, the atomic bomb. It was a fire so powerful, it could turn buildings to dust and people to shadows burned onto stone. That terrifying new sun cast a long, cold shadow that now stretched across the whole world. This wasn't some far-off problem you heard about on the news and forgot. It was a constant, nagging whisper in the back of everyone's mind. Glennie Langford, the 50-year-old woman who owned the little farmhouse in Kelly, Kentucky, felt it every day. She'd be sitting on her porch in the evening listening to the radio, and a newsman's voice would talk about the Russians. The Soviet Union had the bomb now, too. The world was split right down the middle, with an invisible iron curtain between the two sides, and both of them had the power to wipe out everything in a single afternoon. The new rule of war wasn't about winning anymore. It was a cold, simple promise called mutual assured destruction. It meant if you bomb us, we'll bomb you right back, and all that will be left is a silent, poisoned planet. Sometimes the radio would go quiet, and a long, high-pitched tone would fill the air. It was just a test of the emergency broadcast system, but it always sent a chill down Glennie's spine. It was a reminder, a practice run for the end of the world. She'd look out at the fields her family worked so hard on, at the trees standing dark against the setting sun, and she'd feel a knot tighten in her stomach. The world she knew, the life she had built, could all be gone in a single blinding flash of light. This fear trickled down into everything. Her grandchildren, when they came to visit from town, would talk about their school drills. An air raid siren would scream, and these little kids would have to dive under their flimsy wooden desks, covering their heads with their hands. It was a grim little play, pretending a school desk could save you from a fire that could melt steel. They were being taught over and over that the sky was no longer safe. It could bring death at any moment. It was a lesson no child should ever have to learn. Glennie would see a plane flying high overhead, a silver speck against the blue, and for a split second her heart would jump into her throat. It was just a passenger plane, she'd tell herself, but the fear was automatic, a reflex trained into her by years of living under that atomic shadow. The sky, which used to be the home of God and the source of rain for her crops, had become a place to watch with suspicion. It was the highway an enemy could use to deliver annihilation without any warning at all. And into this nervous, watchful world, a new story was born. It started in 1947, when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold, a good, respectable man, saw 9 strange, shiny objects flying near a mountain. He said they moved weirdly, like a saucer skipping across water. A newspaper reporter heard that and came up with a name that stuck, the flying saucer. Suddenly, the fear of Russian bombers had a new, stranger face. The idea of visitors from space exploded. It was in all the magazines with their flashy, colorful covers showing bug-eyed monsters and sleek silver ships. It was in the movies, where giant robots and terrifying aliens came down from the sky to destroy our cities. These stories were so popular because they touched on both our biggest hopes and our deepest fears. The hope that we weren't alone, that there was a wondrous future out there among the stars, and the fear of being invaded, of being completely helpless against a power we couldn't possibly understand or fight. The alien became a new kind of boogeyman for an age that was already full of them. For Glennie Langford and her family, living out in the quiet countryside, these weren't just silly stories. They were part of the air they breathed. They heard the news, they saw the magazines in town. The idea that something might come down from the sky wasn't just a fantasy anymore. After seeing what a bomb could do, it felt like anything was possible. They were already taught to watch the sky for a threat. They just had no idea that on this night, the threat wouldn't be a Russian plane. It would be something far, far stranger. Something that would feel like it had crawled right out of one of those scary magazines and into their front yard. And it would be terrifyingly real. The Sutton farmhouse wasn't much to look at. It was a simple 3-room house that had never seen a coat of paint. The wood had been baked by the sun and washed by the rain for so many years that it had turned a soft, silvery gray. It stood alone, surrounded by fields of tobacco in the deep, dark woods of rural Kentucky. Life here was tied to the earth. It was a life of hard work, of soil under your fingernails, and the sweet, heavy smell of curing tobacco leaves hanging in the barn. It was a life that didn't leave a lot of time for foolishness or wild stories. The house was a world away from the cities. There was no telephone line running to it, which meant that if you needed help, it was miles away down a dark, bumpy dirt road. And on this hot August night, the most important thing it didn't have was indoor plumbing. If you needed a drink of water or had to use the bathroom, you had to step outside into the night. That simple fact, that need to open the door and walk out into the darkness, would become the hinge on which the whole night would turn. It meant the line between the safety of the house and the unknown of the outside world was a line they had to cross. On this particular Sunday, Glennie Langford's house was full to bursting. It was a typical family gathering. In all, there were 11 people crammed into that little house, 8 adults and 3 children. Glennie was there, of course. Her children were there with their husbands and wives. And visiting from Pennsylvania was a family friend, a young man of 21 named Billy Ray Taylor, and his wife, June. The house was alive with the comfortable sounds of family. The low murmur of the men's voices drifted from the main room, where they were playing a game of cards. You could hear their easy laughter, the shuffle of the deck, the clink of glasses on the wooden table. The women were in the kitchen, cleaning up from supper, their conversation a soft counterpoint to the men's game. The children, tired from a day of running around outside, were being put to bed in the back room. It was a perfect picture of peace, a small island of light and warmth in the vast dark countryside. The air was thick and humid, the kind of summer night where sound travels a long way. Through the open windows, you could hear the steady, pulsing chorus of crickets and cicadas, a sound so constant it was like a form of silence. Inside, the light from the bare bulbs cast a warm yellow glow, making the familiar rooms feel safe and cozy. This little house was a sanctuary, a place where the worries of the world, the Russians, the bombs, the anxieties on the radio could be shut out, at least for a little while. Here, surrounded by family, life felt simple and real. One of the kids, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was having trouble sleeping. He called out from the bedroom, his voice small in the quiet house, "Grandma, can I have a drink of water?" Glennie's son, Lucky Sutton, looked up from his cards. "I'll get it," he said, pushing his chair back. But Billy Ray Taylor, the visitor, was already on his feet. "I've got it, Lucky. Sit back down before you lose all your money," he joked. The other men chuckled. Billy Ray was a good-natured young man, always eager to help. "Well, ain't you a gentleman?" someone else said with a grin. "Just watch your step out there. It's black as pitch tonight." Billy Ray grabbed a metal bucket from beside the kitchen sink. "Don't you worry about me," he said, his voice full of the easy confidence of a young man who had never known a moment of real fear in his life. He pushed open the screen door, letting it slam shut behind him with a familiar creak and a bang. The sounds of the house, the laughter, the talking, faded as he stepped out into the night. He was walking out of a world that made sense and into one that was about to break apart. He was just going to get a bucket of water. It was the most normal thing in the world, but it was the last normal thing that would happen that night. The night air hit Billy Ray Taylor like a warm, wet cloth. The heat of the day still lingered, trapped in the humid air. The chorus of crickets seemed to get louder the moment the screen door slammed behind him, 1,000 tiny voices filling the darkness. The well was only a short walk from the back porch, a simple hand pump sticking out of the ground. He'd done this 100 times before. It was a simple chore, a moment of quiet between the noise of the house and the silence of the fields. As he reached the pump, something caught his eye, a flash of light high up in the sky. He paused, bucket in hand, and looked up. It wasn't a shooting star, and it wasn't a plane. This was something else. A glowing, silvery object, shaped like a flattened disc, was streaking across the sky. It moved without a sound, a ghostly silence that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. In a world of loud cars and roaring tractors, its perfect silence was the most shocking thing about it. The object glowed with a soft light that seemed to come from inside it, and its metallic surface shimmered, catching the last faint bits of twilight. Trailing behind it was a tail of brilliant fiery colors, reds, greens, and blues, like a rainbow that had been set on fire. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. His mind raced, trying to find a box to put this in. A weather balloon. A new kind of military jet from the nearby army base. Nothing fit. It moved with a smooth, controlled grace that felt intelligent. He stood frozen, the water bucket completely forgotten, and watched as the object passed directly over the farmhouse. Then it tilted downward, dropping at a steep, sharp angle. It disappeared behind a line of trees in a small gully not far from the house. A moment later, he heard two sounds cut through the chirping of the crickets. A faint, airy hiss, like letting the air out of a giant tire, followed by a soft, solid thud, the sound of something heavy settling onto the earth. For a second, he just stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he turned and ran. He burst back into the farmhouse, the screen door flying open and slamming against the wall with a crash that made everyone jump. The cards scattered across the table. Every face in the room turned to him. He was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Words tumbled out of his mouth in a frantic, breathless rush. A spaceship. I saw a spaceship. It landed. It landed out in the gully. For a moment, there was dead silence. Then a single chuckle broke the tension, and the whole room erupted in laughter. It wasn't mean-spirited laughter. It was the easy, dismissive laughter of practical people who had just heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. These were folks who dealt with real things. Weather, crops, and broken-down tractors. Flying saucers were the stuff of silly movies and comic books, not things that landed in your backyard in Kelly, Kentucky. Lucky Sutton, Glennie's son, leaned back in his chair, a wide grin on his face. Maybe you spent a little too much time out in that hot sun today. Someone else chimed in. You've been getting into the corn liquor, Billy Ray. The laughter rolled through the room again. They tried to find any logical explanation they could grab onto. They were a family that didn't get fooled easily. Their skepticism was the solid ground they stood on, the foundation of their world. Billy Ray tried to argue, to make them understand what he had seen, but they just shook their heads and smiled, telling him to sit down and catch his breath. That laughter was the last moment of their old lives. It was the sound of a world that made sense, a world where strange lights in the sky were just shooting stars, and the only things that came out of the woods were raccoons and deer. That laughter was a wall they put up to protect that world. But something was out there in the dark now, something that was about to tear that wall down brick by brick. Something was about to happen that was so powerful, so undeniable, that it would turn their easy laughter into raw, terrified screams. The ordinary night was over. The impossible was about to begin. For the next hour, a strange and heavy quiet fell over the farmhouse. Billy Ray's wild story had been laughed away, but his words still hung in the thick, humid air like smoke. The card game started up again, but it was clumsy and distracted. The easy conversation faded into mumbled words and long silences. Across the room, people would catch each other's eyes, a silent question passing between them. What if he wasn't crazy? What if he really saw something? The seed of doubt had been planted, and in the quiet of the house it was starting to grow. They tried to go on with their evening. The women finished cleaning the kitchen, their movements slow and deliberate. The children were tucked into bed, their parents pulling the blankets up to their chins, hoping the familiar comfort of their beds could protect them from the strange tension that was slowly filling the rooms. The adults sat and tried to play their game, tried to talk about the weather or the price of tobacco, but the relaxed, happy feeling was gone. It had been replaced by a low, humming anxiety. Outside, the crickets kept up their endless chirping song, but tonight it didn't sound peaceful. It sounded like a clock ticking, counting down to something. Every little sound from the darkness was suddenly magnified. The snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. The rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze sounded like footsteps. Then around 8 p.m., the moment came, the turning point. It wasn't a strange light in the sky or a voice from the woods. It was a sound that every person who has ever lived in the country understands in their bones. It was the sound of a dog telling you that something is deeply, terribly wrong. The family dog, who had been sleeping peacefully under the porch, suddenly erupted. This wasn't his normal bark, the one he used for a stray cat or a car coming up the road. This was a sound of pure primal terror. It was a furious, panicked, non-stop explosion of barking, a desperate alarm that screamed of a dangerous intruder in his territory. It was the sound of an animal that had come face to face with something it did not recognize, something its instincts told it was a threat to its very life. The sound was so violent, so filled with raw panic that it sliced through the house and instantly silenced every person inside. Every head snapped up. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. That sound was all the proof they needed. The laughter from an hour ago now seemed like a stupid, childish thing from a lifetime ago. The dog's absolute terror confirmed Billy Ray's story in a way his own breathless words never could have. Something was outside. The sound jolted Elmer Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor into action. They moved fast, their faces grim. They grabbed their guns. Lucky took his 20-gauge shotgun, and Billy Ray grabbed a .22 rifle. These weren't toys. They were tools they used for hunting and for protecting their home. They were men who knew how to use them. As they headed for the back door, the dog's furious barking suddenly broke. It turned into a series of terrified yelps and whimpers. The animal, its courage completely shattered, tucked its tail between its legs and scrambled to hide underneath the house. It would stay there, trembling and whimpering in fear, until the sun came up the next morning. No amount of calling or coaxing could get it to come out. The dog's instincts were screaming a clear and chilling message to the humans. Whatever is out there is something you should not face. Run. Lucky and Billy Ray ignored the warning. They reached the back door and paused, listening. The dog's whimpers faded away, and the night was filled once again with the chirping of the crickets, which now sounded mocking and unnaturally loud. They took a deep breath, their hearts pounding in their chests, and peered out into the deep, moonless dark of the Kentucky night. Lucky Sutton pushed the wooden door open just a crack, the old hinges groaning in the tense silence. He and Billy Ray peered out into the yard, a black void where familiar shapes had melted into threatening shadows. The big oak tree was a hulking giant. The fence line was a row of jagged teeth. But there was something new out there tonight, something that didn't belong. A strange, soft glow was coming from the woods, filtering through the trees. It came from the exact spot in the gully where Billy Ray had seen the object come down. It wasn't the warm, flickering light of a campfire, and it wasn't the sharp, steady beam of a flashlight. This was a cool, eerie, pulsing light, like a sick heartbeat in the darkness, and it seemed to be getting closer. As they watched, their breath held tight in their chests, a figure stepped out of the glow. It emerged from the tree line and started moving toward the house. Their minds struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. It was small, no taller than one of the children, maybe 3.5 feet high. Its head was huge and perfectly round, like a pale balloon. Far too big for its thin, spindly body. Its arms were long, unnaturally long, dangling almost to the ground, and its movements were all wrong. It didn't walk like a person or an animal. It moved with a strange, stiff, swaying motion, as if it were wading through the invisible water, and it was coming straight for them, moving with a steady, relentless purpose that was absolutely terrifying. In that single, horrifying moment, every last shred of doubt, every last bit of hope that this was all some kind of mistake, evaporated in a flash of pure, heart-stopping dread. This was real. This was happening. The impossible was walking up their lawn. The men didn't hesitate. They didn't shout. They acted on pure survival instinct. They slammed the heavy wooden door shut, the sound echoing through the small house like a cannon shot. Lucky fumbled with the thick metal bolt and rammed it home with a solid thunk. The sound sealed them in. The feeling inside the house changed instantly. The nervous curiosity of the last hour was gone, burned away and replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a life or death threat. The thing from the woods was not a lost traveler. It was not a friend. There was no more room for questions, no more time for laughter. There was only the shared, terrifying image of that impossible creature walking toward their home. Panic erupted in the room. The women who had been watching from behind the men gasped and hurried to gather the children, pulling them close and trying to shield their eyes. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling. They were no longer a family enjoying a Sunday evening together. They were defenders of a tiny wooden fortress that was about to be attacked. They were trapped, and the enemy was just outside the door. Lucky and Billy Ray took up positions at the windows, their knuckles white as they gripped their guns. They peered out into the darkness, trying to catch another glimpse of the creature. The house was silent now, except for the sound of ragged, fearful breathing and the quiet sobs of one of the children. They were preparing to protect their home and their family from an enemy they couldn't understand, an enemy that shouldn't even exist. The strange story had become a battle. The long, dark night had just begun. This was the beginning of a war. For 4 long, agonizing hours, the family was trapped in a nightmare that repeated itself over and over. It was a cycle of strange appearances, frantic gunfire, and physics that just didn't make sense. It was a relentless attack that seemed designed to shred their nerves, use up all their ammunition, and push them right to the very edge of sanity. The first creature continued its swaying approach to the back of the house. As it got closer, it raised its grotesquely long, spindly arms. The arms ended not in hands, but in large, dark claws that looked sharp and dangerous. This was not a friendly wave. It was a clear, unmistakable threat that sent a fresh wave of terror through the people inside the house. At the window, Lucky and Billy Ray stood their ground, their guns raised and ready. They waited, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs, until the creature was only about 20 feet from the back door, an easy, can't-miss shot for the shotgun. In the dim, eerie glow that seemed to come from the creature itself, they could clearly see its huge round head, its shimmering skin, and its completely inhuman shape. They took aim. Someone shouted a warning out into the night, a desperate, angry cry to get away from here. Then they opened fire. The whole house shook as the shotgun roared and the rifle cracked. The sound was deafening in the small space, rattling the windows in their frames, and filling the air with the sharp, biting smell of gunpowder. The men expected to see the creature blown apart. They expected to hear a scream of pain. Instead, the night answered with a sound that broke their brains. It wasn't the wet, heavy thud of buckshot tearing through flesh and bone. It was a sharp, loud, metallic clang. Every single person in that house would later describe it the exact same way. It sounded like they were shooting at a metal bucket. In that one ringing, impossible moment, they understood. Their guns, their only defense, were completely useless. The creature's reaction was just as bizarre and terrifying. Hit dead on by a shotgun blast that should have ripped it to pieces. It didn't bleed or cry out. It simply flipped backward in a smooth acrobatic somersault, landed on its feet as if pulled up by invisible strings, and then scurried away into the darkness at an inhuman speed. It was completely, impossibly unharmed. The men stood there in stunned silence, the gun smoke curling around them, their minds struggling to process what they had just seen. It had to be wounded, they thought. It had to be. They quickly reloaded, unlocked the door, and took a cautious step out onto the back porch, planning to look for a body. As they stepped outside, a sudden movement above them made them look up, and their blood ran cold. Perched on the narrow overhang of the roof, directly above their heads, was another one of the creatures. Its massive, luminous yellow eyes glowed down at them like 2 burning coals in the blackness. It had been there the whole time, watching them, waiting. Acting on pure, terrified instinct, they raised their guns and fired again, point blank, at the thing on the roof. The same metallic clang echoed through the yard as the blast knocked the creature from its perch. But in a horrifying defiance of everything they knew about the world, it didn't fall. It didn't crash to the ground. It floated. It drifted gently downward, its long, thin limbs dangling beneath it like a weightless puppet, and landed on the ground with a silent, eerie grace before it vanished into the shadows. That first violent encounter set the brutal rules for the rest of the night. Their visitors were small. They glowed. They made a metallic sound when you shot them, and they were, for all practical purposes, invincible. But the most terrifying rule of all was that they didn't have to obey the laws of nature. For them, gravity was just a suggestion. The family was trapped, surrounded by beings from another reality, beings whose movements they couldn't predict and whose bodies they couldn't harm. The fight for their home had just become a siege against their sanity. The battle for the farmhouse turned into a cruel and twisted game. The family started calling the creatures goblins, a word pulled from old dark fairy tales, because it was the only thing that seemed to fit, and the goblins in turn began a campaign of pure psychological torture. It was a deadly game of peekaboo. a horrifying ordeal that felt like being trapped in a carnival funhouse designed by a madman. They were being toyed with, harassed by beings who seemed to find their terror amusing. A glowing face with huge luminous yellow eyes would suddenly appear at a window, its head tilted, peering in with a cold, detached curiosity. The men would rush to that side of the house and fire their guns, the blast shattering the window pane, only to hear a scream from the other side of the house as another face popped up at a different window, a silent, mocking presence in the dark. The family scrambled from room to room, their feet slipping on the broken glass, firing blindly into the night. Each shot was answered by the same frustrating, terrifying clang of bullets bouncing off metal. They never saw more than one or two of the creatures at a time, but the chaotic, darting appearances made it feel like they were surrounded by a whole army, a net of fear tightening around their little wooden house. In a moment of desperate bravery, or maybe just frustration, Billy Ray Taylor decided he needed a clearer shot. One of the creatures was lingering near the edge of the trees, its silvery form just visible in the darkness. He figured if he could just step outside the back door, onto the porch, he could get a better angle. "Cover me," he said to Lucky, his voice tight. He unbolted the door and slipped out, standing just under the shallow overhang of the roof. The cool night air felt strange on his skin after the stuffy, gunpowder-filled house. He raised his .22 rifle, trying to get the creature in his sights. He was completely focused on the target in front of him, so focused that he didn't notice the new threat, the one that was coming from directly above. Inside, the women were watching him through the doorway. One of them happened to glance up. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened, but for a second no sound came out. Then she let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that ripped through the night. The scream snapped Billy Ray out of his concentration. At the same instant, he felt something. It wasn't a blow. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a touch. A chillingly light, impossibly fast touch, like cold spider legs grazing the top of his head. He looked up just in time to see a long, thin, metallic arm retracting back up onto the roof. At the end of it was a hand, but it wasn't a hand. It was a claw, with long, sharp talons that glinted in the dim light. Before he could even react, strong hands grabbed him from behind and yanked him backward, pulling him violently through the doorway and back into the house. The door slammed shut, and the bolt was thrown. Lucky, his face a mask of fury and terror, fired his shotgun blindly up through the thin wooden roof of the porch. The blast tore a ragged hole in the wood, but it was met with only empty air. Billy Ray stood there trembling, his hand flying to his head. His hair was there. He was okay, but he had been touched. One of them had reached down from the darkness and put its claw on him. It wasn't an attack meant to kill him. It was something else, something far stranger and more violating. It was as if it had been trying to take something from him, a sample, a piece of him. That single light touch was the most terrifying moment of the entire night. It was an act that shifted the horror from a simple home invasion to something deeply personal. They weren't just trying to scare them anymore. They were studying them, and Billy Ray Taylor had just become a specimen. The terrifying cycle of harassment continued for what felt like an eternity. The night stretched on, each minute crawling by, thick with dread. The house, which had once been their sanctuary, was now a war zone. The men had riddled their own home with holes, turning the walls into something like Swiss cheese. The air was heavy with the smell of spent gunpowder, fear sweat, and the damp, earthy scent of the Kentucky night, filtering in through the shattered windows. Each time a glowing face appeared, each time a scratching sound came from the roof, the men would fire, and each time, their desperate act of defiance was met with the same soul-crushing answer, the sharp metallic clang of a useless bullet, followed by the silent, fluid disappearance of their tormentor. Their ammunition was running low. They were down to their last few shells. Their nerves were frayed raw. The initial adrenaline-fueled courage had long since burned away, replaced by a suffocating, hopeless dread. They felt a sense of complete and utter powerlessness that was more terrifying than any monster. This was no longer a fight to protect their property. It was a fight for their lives, and more than that, a fight for their sanity. They felt like rats trapped in a maze, with cruel, unseen scientists watching them from just outside the glass, taking notes on how they reacted to the terror. The creature's behavior was so bizarre, so illogical. They were clearly invulnerable, so they could have broken into the house at any moment. They could have smashed through a door or climbed through a broken window. But they never tried. They seemed content to just stay outside, appearing and disappearing, their glowing yellow eyes watching, always watching. Glennie Langford, a woman whose faith was as solid as the ground she farmed, found herself praying. In her mind, these were not creatures from another planet. Science fiction was for the kids. This was something older, something darker. As she watched the men fire their guns to no effect, a cold certainty settled in her heart. These were demons, evil spirits sent by the devil himself to torment her family. That was the only explanation that made sense to her. You couldn't fight a spiritual evil with physical weapons. A shotgun was useless against a demon. As she huddled in the corner with her grandchildren, her lips moved in silent, desperate prayer, the only weapon she had left. The children were crying, their small bodies trembling. The adults tried to comfort them, whispering soothing words they didn't believe themselves. How do you explain to a child that there are monsters outside? But it's okay. How do you tell them they're safe when the walls of their own home are being shot to pieces, and the grown-ups are just as scared as they are? Then around 11 p.m., after hours of nonstop terror, it suddenly stopped. The glowing faces vanished from the windows. The scratching noises on the roof ceased. A profound and heavy silence fell over the farmhouse. The sudden quiet was in its own way more menacing than the chaos that had come before it. Was it a trick? Were they just outside, waiting, listening, exhausted, terrified, and almost completely out of ammunition? The family huddled together in the main room, listening to the silence. They knew they couldn't survive another attack. They had to get out. They had to get help. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. Lucky looked at the others, his face grim in the dim light. "Now," he whispered. "We all go now." There was no more discussion. They all knew what they had to do. In a single frantic rush, all 11 of them, the men, the women, and the crying, terrified children, burst out of the front door. They didn't look back. They scrambled into their 2 cars, piling on top of one another in a desperate heap. Engines roared to life, shattering the dead quiet of the night. Tires spun in the dirt, kicking up clouds of dust as they sped away from the besieged farmhouse. They raced down the dark country roads, the familiar turns now feeling like a path through a nightmare. They were fleeing their home, fleeing the darkness, and heading toward the distant, comforting lights of Hopkinsville. They sped toward the police station, the one place in the world they believed could bring order back to their shattered lives. Their plea to the officer on duty would be simple, desperate, and completely unbelievable. "We need help," they would say, their voices shaking. "We've been fighting them for nearly 4 hours." The doors of the Hopkinsville police station flew open just after 11 o'clock, letting in a gust of humid night air and a flood of panicked human beings. 11 people, men with grim, exhausted faces, women with tear-streaked cheeks, and children who were sobbing uncontrollably, poured into the quiet station. They were a chaotic mess of pale faces and rumpled clothes, and they were all talking at once, their voices high and strained with terror. They babbled about a siege, about goblins with glowing eyes, and about a 4-hour gunfight against an enemy that couldn't be killed. Police Chief Russell Greenwell was the man on duty that night. He was a seasoned cop, a man who had heard every kind of wild story you could imagine, from drunken brawls to domestic disputes that defied belief. But this was different. He saw something in their eyes that he had never seen before. It was a raw, genuine terror that was so powerful it was almost contagious. These people weren't drunk, and they weren't trying to pull a prank. They were, as he would later describe it, terrified by something beyond reason, not ordinary. Their fear was a living thing in the room, so thick you could almost taste it. It was in their trembling hands as they clutched at each other, in their shaking voices, as they huddled together as if they expected the creatures to come bursting right through the station doors after them. Chief Greenwell knew, with the certainty of a man who had looked into the eyes of liars and lunatics his entire career, that these people absolutely believed every word they were saying. They had lived through something that had shattered them. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Greenwell didn't hesitate. He put together a large, multi-agency response team. It included his own Hopkinsville City police officers, several Kentucky state troopers, and a few county deputy sheriffs. Most importantly, 4 military police officers from the nearby Fort Campbell Army Base also joined the convoy. In the tense, paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, a report of a 4-hour firefight with unknown intruders happening just a few miles from a major military installation was not something to be taken lightly. The convoy of police cars and military vehicles, their lights flashing, raced back through the dark country roads to the isolated Sutton farmhouse. When they arrived, the scene was both convincing and confusing. The yard and the porch were littered with spent shotgun shells and empty bullet casings. The thin wooden walls of the house and the screens on the windows were riddled with fresh holes from all the gunfire. The family's story of a massive gunfight was obviously true. They had been shooting at something, and they had been shooting at it for hours. But the attackers themselves had vanished without a trace. The officers conducted a thorough, methodical search of the entire property, sweeping the house, the yard, and the surrounding woods with their powerful flashlights. They found nothing. There were no bodies. There was no blood. There were no strange footprints in the soft dirt of the yard. There was not a single solitary piece of physical evidence to prove who or what the family had been fighting. And yet, some of the trained professional officers saw strange things themselves that night. One of the state troopers reported seeing odd meteor-like objects streaking silently across the sky near the farm. Another officer noticed a strange, luminous patch of light on the ground in the yard, right where one of the creatures had supposedly been shot down. As he walked toward it to get a better look, the glow simply faded away into nothing. A third officer caught a fleeting glimpse of a green light deep in the woods, a light that blinked out the very moment he turned his flashlight on it. These weren't normal lights. They were bizarre, unexplainable, and by the time the sun came up, they were gone. In the end, the most powerful piece of evidence the police had was the family itself. Their deep, unshakable fear was something the experienced officers simply couldn't dismiss. When they were interviewed separately, away from each other, every single family member told the exact same terrifying story, with the exact same key details. The small glowing creatures with huge yellow eyes, the impossible metallic sound of bullets hitting them, their strange floating movements, their long arms and taloned hands. They weren't collaborating on a lie. They were all remembering the same shared nightmare. The authorities who were actually there that night were left with a profound and deeply disturbing mystery. They knew something violent and terrifying had happened at that farmhouse. They just had no idea who the attackers were. The official response from the U.S. Air Force, however, would be a very different story. The case was logged by Project Blue Book, the military's official team for investigating UFO reports, but it was never truly investigated. No one from the Air Force ever came to interview the police officers or the military police who had witnessed the strange lights. No one came to seriously examine the evidence at the scene. Their final official conclusion, recorded without any supporting evidence or explanation, was a single insulting word: hoax. That official explanation makes absolutely no sense. A hoax has to have a reason, like a desire for fame or money. But the Sutton family got neither of those things. What they got was national ridicule and an endless stream of harassment from gawkers and thrill-seekers who swarmed their farm. The pressure became so intense that they were eventually forced to abandon their home, their land, and their entire way of life. They lost everything. Why would anyone invent a lie that would destroy their own life? The truth is, the Air Force in the 1950s wasn't really trying to investigate UFOs. They were secretly being told by a CIA group that their real job was to debunk them. The government was afraid that public panic over flying saucers could clog up communication channels during a real national emergency, like a surprise attack from the Soviets. So the Air Force's new unwritten mission was to shut these stories down, to make them go away as quickly as possible. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter, with its credible witnesses, its clear evidence of a gunfight, and its closeness to a military base, was a public relations nightmare. Calling it a hoax was the fastest and easiest way to discredit the witnesses and close the file. The federal government wasn't trying to find the truth of what happened that night. It was trying to bury it. By 2:15 in the morning, the police were gone. They had done their job. They had searched the farm, they had taken statements, and they had collected the empty shell casings as evidence. But with no attackers to arrest and no immediate threat to be seen, there was nothing more they could do. The flashing red and blue lights of their cars disappeared down the dark country road, their comforting presence swallowed by the night. The family was alone again in their bullet-riddled home. Having the police there had been like a temporary shield, a brief return to a world that made sense, a world with rules and authorities who could protect you. But now that shield was gone. The deep, oppressive silence of the country night rushed back in to fill the void, and it felt heavier and more dangerous than ever before. The chirping of the crickets, which had been drowned out by the noise of the investigation, started up again. Now their song sounded unnaturally loud, almost like they were mocking the family's brief moment of hope. The law had come, they had looked, and they had left. They were on their own again. They huddled together inside their broken house. The doors and windows were shattered and full of holes, letting in the cool night air and the menacing sounds of the darkness. Every shadow thrown by the dim indoor light seemed to twist and move. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like the scrape of a claw or a soft swaying footstep. They were bone-tired, their bodies screaming for sleep after the hours of terror and adrenaline. But sleep was an impossible luxury. All they could do was sit, wait, and listen. Their few remaining bullets sitting in a small pile on the kitchen table. Their nightmare was not over. The creatures were not finished with them. Around 3:30 a.m., Glennie Langford couldn't sit up any longer. She went into her bedroom at the back of the house, hoping to get just a few minutes of rest. She lay down on her bed, still fully clothed, and closed her eyes. But her mind was wide awake, replaying the horrors of the night. That's when she heard it. It was a soft, scraping noise from right outside, a dry, scratchy sound brushing against the wooden wall right next to her window. Her heart, which had just started to slow down, began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She held her breath, listening. The scraping stopped. She told herself it was just a tree branch. It had to be a tree branch. Slowly, cautiously, she turned her head on the pillow and looked toward the window. A face was pressed against the glass, staring in at her. It was one of them. Its huge yellow eyes were glowing in the pitch blackness. Two burning circles of light that seemed to look right through her, right into her soul. In their eerie light, she could see its face. The lipless, slit-like mouth, the smooth, round head, which was tilted to one side, as if it were studying her with a cold, alien curiosity, like a scientist looking at a bug under a microscope. The scream that tore out of Glennie Langford's throat was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of pure, soul-shattering horror, the sound of a mind breaking. It ripped through the silent house, jolting everyone to their feet. The men grabbed their guns from the table and rushed into her room. More shots rang out, the blast blowing out what was left of the bedroom window and filling the room with smoke. They heard the now familiar, sickening clang of bullets bouncing off metal. When the smoke cleared, the face was gone. Just as before, the creature had vanished back into the darkness, completely unharmed. The return of the creatures was the ultimate act of psychological warfare. It was a clear and terrifying message. The police can't help you. Your guns can't hurt us. We were not driven away. We left because we chose to, and we have returned because we choose to. You have no power here. You have no control. You are completely, utterly at our mercy. The family saw the creatures one last time, just as the night was finally beginning to die. Around 4:45 a.m., the absolute blackness of the sky started to soften into a deep, dark gray. As the first hint of dawn pushed back against the darkness, the family, huddled together and peering out of their broken windows, watched them go. They didn't vanish in a flash of light or scurry away in a panic. They simply retreated, moving with that same eerie, swaying motion, back into the dark woods they had come from. Then, as the sun began to climb above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, they were gone. The full light of day revealed the brutal aftermath of their one-sided war. The yard was a mess, littered with the shiny brass of spent shotgun shells and bullet casings. The window screens were shredded, hanging in tatters. The gray, weathered walls of their home were pocked with dozens of dark, round bullet holes. Broken glass from the shattered windows glinted on the floorboards inside, sparkling like cruel diamonds in the morning sun. In the harsh light of day, the evidence of their desperate, hopeless battle was everywhere. Their home looked like it had been through a firefight, because it had. Looking at the wreckage, a silent, unspoken understanding passed between every member of the family. They could not stay here. This place had been their home, their sanctuary, the center of their world. But that feeling of safety was gone forever, shattered into a million pieces along with their windows. The police had been powerless to help them. The creatures had come back even after the officers had left. There was no reason to believe they wouldn't come back again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Numb from shock and a sleepless night of absolute terror, they began to move. There was very little talking. They moved like ghosts through the ruins of their home, packing what few belongings they could carry. A few changes of clothes, a handful of personal items. They abandoned the farmhouse, leaving behind most of their possessions, their furniture, their crops still waiting in the fields, their entire lives. You don't abandon your life's work over a simple mistake or a made-up story. You do it when you are escaping a living nightmare that the daylight can't erase. They piled back into their 2 cars, the same cars they had used to flee in the middle of the night. They drove away from the farmhouse without looking back, running from a place that was no longer a home, but a source of recurring, unimaginable horror. They were refugees driven from their land not by a fire or a flood, but by the memory of glowing yellow eyes, the impossible sound of bullets striking metal, and the chilling touch of a claw in the dark. The goblins had won. They hadn't needed to break down the door. They had simply made the family's world so terrifying that they had no choice but to leave it behind forever. The story of what happened at that little farmhouse in Kelly, Kentucky, spread like wildfire. But as it traveled from person to person, from newspaper to newspaper, it began to change. The truth of that terrifying night got twisted. And one of the strangest parts of the whole story is how it accidentally gave the world the phrase "little green men." The 11 people who lived through that nightmare were all very clear and consistent in their story. The creatures were a shimmering, silvery, metallic color that seemed to glow from within. Not a single witness ever said they were green. But in our culture, the color green has always been linked with strange, otherworldly beings like goblins, fairies, and gremlins. And let's be honest, the phrase "little green men" is catchier and sounds a lot sillier and less threatening than "little silver men." So reporters, looking for a snappy headline, started using the term, and it stuck. A fiction born from a simple misunderstanding became a cultural icon. The genuinely terrifying details of the Hopkinsville creatures, their metallic skin, their ability to float, their immunity to bullets, were slowly forgotten, replaced in the public's mind by a cartoonish image. The raw primal terror of the Sutton family's experience was sanitized and turned into a pop culture joke. Their private horror became public entertainment. The story even reached Hollywood and inspired a young director named Steven Spielberg. In the late 1970s, he was planning to make a dark, scary movie based directly on the Kelly-Hopkinsville case. He called it Night Skies. The movie was going to be about a rural family trapped in their farmhouse and attacked by goblin-like aliens. But Spielberg eventually decided the story was just too dark and terrifying, and he put it aside. The ideas from that script, however, were too powerful to just throw away. They were eventually split into 2 of the most famous movies of the 1980s. The scary parts, the family under siege in their own home by malevolent supernatural forces, were channeled into the classic horror film Poltergeist. And the one gentle element of the Night Skies script, a friendly alien who befriends a lonely boy, was expanded into the heartwarming story of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The terrifying siege at that small Kentucky farmhouse planted the creative seeds for 2 of the most beloved films of a generation. While their story was becoming entertainment for the rest of the world, the real-life aftermath for the Sutton and Taylor families was a second nightmare. The media attention brought a new kind of siege, this one carried out by other people. Hundreds of reporters, tourists, and skeptics descended on their small farm. They trampled their property, peered into their windows, and treated the family like a roadside freak show. In a cruel twist, the family found themselves trapped in their home all over again, their privacy destroyed by a public that was recreating the very terror they had just survived. They were mercilessly ridiculed in the national press. They were called ignorant hillbillies who were either lying to get attention or were too stupid to tell the difference between an alien and a great horned owl. Their genuine terror was dismissed as a drunken fantasy. Overwhelmed by the constant harassment and public scorn, the family finally sold their farm at a loss and moved away, hoping to disappear and find some peace. Yet through all the ridicule, through the loss of their home and the complete destruction of their lives, the surviving witnesses and their children never changed their story. For more than 60 years, they never once backed down or admitted it was all a mistake. Their unwavering consistency, forged in a single terrifying night and held firm against decades of mockery, remains the most compelling and haunting piece of evidence in the entire baffling case. When you strip away all the layers, the jokes, the government's quick denials, the half-baked explanations, the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter remains a deep and unsolvable mystery. It's a story that refuses to be explained away. The official explanation of a hoax falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. The popular skeptical theory that the family was just spooked by a few owls is almost as ridiculous. Owls don't make a loud metallic clang when you shoot them. Owls don't float. Owls don't have long clawed hands that reach for you from the roof. So all the simple explanations fail, and we are left with the one thing that has never changed: the powerful, unshakable testimony of 11 people. For the rest of their lives, they held on to their truth. They described a night under attack by creatures that broke every rule of our reality, beings that were solid enough to scratch a roof and touch a man's hair, yet were immune to bullets and could float through the air as if gravity were just a dream. Maybe the point of this story isn't to find an answer. Maybe its real power is in the uncomfortable questions it forces us to ask. What is reality? How much do we really know about the world around us? And are we truly alone here? The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter is more than just a UFO story. It has become a modern American legend. It's a chilling, true story about the night the unknown came to a small farmhouse in Kentucky. It knocked on the door, and it left a question hanging in the air that haunts us to this day. A question we still can't answer. What was out there in the dark? As we step back from the crossroads, remember, the story doesn't end here, because this is just the beginning. Searching for the knowledge and wisdom to unravel the mysteries of our universe. Unexplained sightings, spirits, and science. They are all connected in the grand tapestry of life. So remember, keep pulling at the threads, because this has been Crossroads of the Veil.